In the United States, land is often treated as if its value only moves in one direction, upward, constantly, without pause. Cities expand outward, suburbs stretch into former farmland, investors compete for acreage before it is even developed, and in many regions, land has become less a physical space and more a financial instrument priced by speculation as much as by use. But that version of America is incomplete. Because beyond the visible centers of growth, beyond the corridors where demand concentrates and drives prices higher year after year, there still exist counties where land behaves differently. Not according to headlines, not according to urban momentum, but according to distance, absence, and time. In these places, an acre of land can still cost around $1,000. A number that feels almost disconnected from the modern economy. Less than a used vehicle in many cases, less than a few months of rent in most cities, and dramatically less than what land commands only a few hundred miles away. At first, this seems like an anomaly. But when you begin to trace it across the map, a pattern starts to emerge. These counties are not random pockets of undervalued land. They are concentrated in specific regions, places where geography and economics intersect in a way that limits demand rather than amplifies it. Across the Great Plains in parts of the Southwest and in older rural interior regions of the country, land stretches in vast uninterrupted spans. Fields extend beyond visible boundaries. Dirt roads cut through miles of open space before reaching a small cluster of buildings that form what remains of a town center. Outside of these centers, the land resumes its dominant presence, quiet, expansive, and sparsely used. The key factor is not just emptiness, it is distance. Distance from major employment hubs, distance from infrastructure networks, distance from population density that drives competition for space, and over time, distance becomes the defining economic force shaping value. Where access is limited, demand weakens. And where demand weakens, price stabilizes at the lowest level the market will sustain. But land does not disappear when its value drops. It remains. It continues to exist in the same physical form, even as its economic meaning shifts. What once may have been part of an expanding agricultural frontier becomes something else entirely, an inheritance, a holding, or simply unused space that no longer attracts strong market attention. In many of these counties, families still own large tracts of land passed down through generations. But ownership does not always translate into activity. Some parcels are actively farmed, but many exist in a quiet state of partial use, maintained but not developed, present but not fully engaged with modern economic cycles. Over time, this creates a unique condition. Land becomes abundant in supply but limited in demand. And that imbalance is what allows prices to remain so low compared to the rest of the country. Yet this is not a story of decline alone. It is also a story of divergence. While some parts of America experience continuous intensification, rising property values, infrastructure expansion, and dense development, other regions follow a slower, more detached trajectory. They are not outside the economy but positioned at its edges where the forces that drive growth are weaker and less consistent. This creates a quiet contrast across the national landscape. One version of America is accelerating. Another is stabilizing. And between them lies a vast rural middle where land still reflects older valuations, shaped less by speculation and more by long-standing patterns of use and absence. At this stage, the question is no longer simply where cheap land exists. It is why it continues to exist at all in an economy defined by constant expansion elsewhere. And that is where the deeper investigation begins. If the first layer of this story is understanding that cheap land still exists, the second layer is realizing that it exists for reasons that are not accidental. These counties are not hidden, they are visible on any map. What makes them invisible in an economic sense is not geography alone but the absence of pressure that usually forces land values upward. Across the Great Plains, for example, the land stretches in long, uninterrupted expanses. The terrain is open, often flat and defined more by scale than by structure. Small towns appear like isolated clusters, thin points of human density surrounded by overwhelming space. Here, land does not compete in the same way it does near cities. There are no dense labor markets pushing housing outward. No suburban expansion corridors forcing farmland conversion. No rapid industrial clustering that increases demand for nearby acreage. Instead, what exists is stability through distance. And that distance matters more than anything else. The farther land is from major infrastructure and population centers, the less friction there is between ownership and demand. And when demand weakens, pricing no longer escalates, it settles. This is how certain counties in states like the Dakotas, Nebraska, and Montana can still show land values hovering near historical lows in select rural parcels. Not because the land is without function, but because the economic forces that typically elevate value are thinly distributed across these regions. The pattern does not end there. Move southwest, and the environment itself begins to shape the same outcome through different conditions. In parts of New Mexico, Arizona, Nevada, and West Texas, land becomes defined by scarcity of water, extreme heat, and vast stretches of undeveloped terrain. Here, distance is no longer just about cities, it is about survivability and infrastructure cost. Water access becomes a defining constraint. Roads are fewer, development is more expensive, agricultural use is limited without significant investment. And because of this, large portions of land remain economically underutilized even if they are physically expansive. In these regions, land value is not necessarily low because the land lacks worth, but because the cost of transforming it into high-value usage is too high relative to expected return. This creates a different kind of equilibrium, one where land remains inexpensive not because it is ignored, but because it is difficult to activate. Then there is a third layer of this pattern, found in older rural interior regions across parts of Appalachia and sections of the American Midwest and South. Unlike the open plains or desert landscapes, these areas are shaped by history. Many of these counties were once tied to industries like mining, small-scale manufacturing, or traditional agriculture. Over time, as those industries shifted or declined, population levels slowly adjusted downward. What remains is a landscape that feels partially paused. Not abandoned but reduced. Forests reclaim older farmland, roads continue to connect towns but traffic is minimal, schools operate at smaller scales, main streets still function but with fewer businesses than in previous decades. And in these environments, land value reflects not only geography but the long shadow of economic transition. When industries leave, people follow. When people leave, demand weakens. And when demand weakens for long enough, prices stabilize at lower levels, not through collapse but through long-term adjustment. Across all these regions, a shared logic becomes visible. It is not one single factor that keeps land near $1,000 per acre. It is the combination of distance, limited demand, and reduced economic pressure. But even this explanation is not the full picture. Because land value is not only shaped by what is absent, it is also shaped by what is changing. And in recent years, subtle shifts have begun to appear in some of these counties: renewable energy development, remote work migration, and long-term land speculation beginning to extend the reach of economic attention into areas once considered peripheral. These changes are not yet strong enough to transform the entire system. But they are strong enough to suggest that the map is not fixed, and that what is cheap today may not remain cheap forever. Which leads to a deeper question that remains unresolved. If these counties are shaped by absence, distance, and historical change, then what happens when those conditions begin to shift again? By the time all the layers are placed together, the map begins to look less like a collection of states and more like a living system, one that expands, contracts, and redistributes value based on where human attention flows. And in that system, the counties where land still costs around $1,000 per acre are not outliers. They are edge conditions. Places where the main forces of economic pressure, population density, infrastructure growth, industrial clustering, arrive in weaker form or not at all. But even edge conditions are not permanent. They are simply slower to change. In the Great Plains, subtle transformation has already begun. Wind energy corridors stretch across counties that once relied almost entirely on agriculture. Towers now rise above fields that have remained unchanged for generations, introducing new forms of land value tied not to farming yield, but to energy production and long-term leasing agreements. In the Southwest, solar development follows a similar path. Vast desert areas that once held minimal economic interest are gradually being reassessed based on sunlight exposure and available land scale. Here, value does not rise uniformly, but in narrow bands, specific parcels becoming more important while surrounding areas remain largely unchanged. And in rural interior regions, the shift is quieter but still present. Remote work, retirement migration, and lifestyle-driven relocation have begun to introduce new buyers into markets that were once defined almost entirely by local demand. Yet despite these changes, the core pattern remains intact. Because what is happening is not a uniform revaluation of land. It is selective attention. Some places are being pulled into new cycles of demand while others remain outside them. And this unevenness ensures that low-cost land does not disappear entirely, it only becomes more fragmented, more localized, and more dependent on specific conditions. This is why the idea of the last counties where land costs $1,000 an acre is both accurate and misleading at the same time. Accurate because such places still exist under certain conditions. Misleading because they are not fixed categories. They are moving targets shaped by ongoing economic shifts that do not affect every region equally. And beneath the economics, there is something more fundamental happening. A quiet redistribution of relevance. Because land value is ultimately a reflection of where people choose to focus their lives, resources, and infrastructure. And as those choices evolve, driven by technology, migration, and environmental constraints, the map adjusts in response. Slowly but continuously. Which leads to the final realization of this entire investigation. These counties are not disappearing. They are not broken. And they are not frozen in time. They are simply operating under a different level of connection to the broader system that defines modern land value. And that connection can strengthen or weaken over time. That is why the existence of $1,000 per acre land is not a historical anomaly. It is a structural outcome of how space, distance, and demand interact across a continent-sized economy. So the question is no longer whether these places exist. They do. The real question is how long they will remain defined by the same conditions that made them cheap in the first place. Because if attention continues to expand outward through remote work, energy development, and new migration patterns, then even the quietest counties may eventually begin to shift. And when they do, they will no longer belong to the category of forgotten land. They will become part of the next wave of discovery. And by then, the map will have already changed again.